All right, thank you for joining. We are continuing our series of networking at the edge, proxies, ingress, and API gateways. Let's go over here. My name is Christian. I work at solo.io, and I've been involved in the community and open source for quite a while now. Most recently, within the last 5 years, I'd say in Kubernetes and helping folks adopt Kubernetes and be successful with it, especially at the application architecture. So basically Kubernetes on up. I've written some books on microservices and service mesh, and I continue to contribute to open source. Some of the books that I've written here, writing Istio in action currently, slowly but surely it is coming along. So what we're doing with this series of videos and either unboxing or introductions to different technology is finding areas of technology that we're interested in at Solo, things like service mesh and API gateways and application networking, and then bringing different episodes to the community and sharing our thoughts and helping you discover new technologies as well. So this will be episode number 8. Last week we did the intro for this series on proxies and gateways. Before that, we did a series on service meshes. So kind of intro to some of the different service meshes, especially the newer ones. And then I did a deep dive on Istio, where we kind of looked at the Istio 1.5 features well before they were even released. And so what we do is we have different engineers, different folks come on for each one of these episodes, giving their perspective and giving their, how they've discovered and worked with these different service meshes. So just to quickly set the tone, we're talking about proxies and API gateways in these next few series. A proxy is some intermediate that allows traffic to traverse through it, on which you can then apply policies about that traffic, whether or not it should be allowed through, collecting telemetry about what is going through, enforcing security, and so forth. So you might be familiar with the term proxy already, either in a reverse proxy or in some of your organizations using an HTTP firewall proxy. This is the space that we're talking about, but we're specifically talking about this in terms of gateways and API gateways for applications and for exposing APIs. And so some of the proxies and the technology that are used to build these types of gateways can be found readily in the typical enterprise, with more recent entrants to this mix, like Envoy Proxy from the CNCF and Trafic. But I'm sure you're familiar with NGINX and HA Proxy. So in this series, we're going to start off by looking at these handful of proxies and gateways. We'll look at some of them based on Envoy, some of them based on NGINX, some of them on Trafic. And today we'll start with by looking at Ambassador, which is an open source API gateway. And I want to give a caveat quickly that I work at Solo, and although we don't compete directly with DataWire, which works on Ambassador, I would say Solo is more working on solving the how do you connect and secure applications across heterogeneous footprints with service mesh and potentially gateways and so forth. So we do see gateways as a big part of the story, and that will overlap with DataWire, whereas we have Gloo and they have Ambassador. DataWire more works on tooling for Kubernetes, developer experience, and they have ambassadors or API gateways. I just want to give that caveat. Next week later next week we'll look at Kong API gateway. Then we'll look at Trafic and Contour from VMware, and then we'll look at Gloo. But we'll have a guest speaker do that one. All right, so let's get going. Ingress, API gateways, we covered a lot of this on the previous episode, but just to refresh, an ingress basically is a point in your architecture or in your Kubernetes cluster that allows traffic to come in and can be routed to the various APIs. Now, this is kind of a superset functionality that you will see in gateways and API gateways and so forth. Typically, the ingress is worried about allowing connections to come into a particular boundary, encrypting the traffic, maybe doing some light routing and so forth. Now, an API gateway builds on top of this concept and not just allows traffic in or secures it and encrypts it and so forth, but it actually abstracts away the details of the underlying services. Whereas in an ingress role, you're exposing the services directly, but they're all coming through this one particular point. In an API gateway, we're abstracting away the details. What the protocols that are being used? What are the message shapes that are being used and so forth? And we expose a different API that the clients end up using. So API gateways abstract away the implementation details inside your boundary. They are responsible for doing things like sophisticated routing, transformation, protocol transformation or translation, so forth, as well as edge functions for applications, things like rate limiting and different security, authentication, authorization protocols, and so forth. Lastly, I'll point out, which relates to the service mesh discussions that we had in previous episodes, the role of the service proxy, which is kind of the opposite of the API gateway, where the API gateway is trying to shield you from having to know anything about the backend implementation. The service proxy is actually giving applications a wealth of knowledge of exactly what the deployment topology looks like. So it's definitely the role of the service proxy is quite different from an API gateway. The service proxy allows applications to know what the topology is, how to find other services, how to communicate, and is all implemented out of processes. You see in the service mesh implementations where we have the sidecar process handling some of this communication for us. All right, so that's kind of let's set the context, refresh a little bit the difference on ingress, API gateways, and service proxies. We're going to be looking at Ambassador, and Ambassador fits the role of an API gateway. So Ambassador was released in May 2017. It is built on Envoy Proxy. It is deployed into Kubernetes and has very Kubernetes ways of configuring the various configuration details. So using CRDs, they actually started off using annotations and allow you to combine them if you'd like, or have them in your CI/CD flow. So Ambassador API gateway kind of looks like this. It sits at the edge of a Kubernetes cluster. Traffic comes in. At that point, we can apply API gateway-like functionality, encrypting the traffic, routing the traffic, establishing rate limiting, and security challenges, and so forth. So from here, I think what we're going to do is jump into getting hands-on with Ambassador like we did in the previous Hoots with the other technology. And we'll start by coming to Google, and we'll do Ambassador API Gateway. Come to their website here, and we can see some of the public-facing information. But what we're going to do is try to get hands-on. So we're going to start with the docs. And one thing I do want to point out is that they do a good job of organizing their docs and explaining some of the concepts that they're building on. So we can very quickly see how to get started. The first steps, go to the quick start guide. And we have different OS level specific installation instructions here. So we can get started by downloading a tool here called edgectl that they use to kind of help bootstrap the API Gateway experience. So let's do that. I already downloaded that. Let's come over here. Hopefully you can see this. edgectl. If we look at the version, we see we're using 1.4. And what we're going to do to install it is just, we're going to just do edgectl install. So edgectl install. And now it's going to ask us for an email address that we would like to use to register with, I guess, let's encrypt here. We can leave that. We'll change it. And then we will let it install here. And we'll give this a second. We can also, if we want, I'm a big fan of this tool called K9s. Okay, type K9s here, and we can actually watch what our cluster is doing. So if we look at the ambassador namespace, we can watch. Oh, why is it doing that? Here. Let's create a new screen. 1 second. That wasn't part of the demo. Namespace, ambassador. Okay. All right, we should see it coming. If I hit L, we should see the logs, and don't see any ominous errors here. All right, so it's up and running. That means if we come back here, we should see that it's continuing. So it looks like it's going to set up a DNS name for us and probably connect that up to the TLS certificates. Okay, so now we have installed Ambassador. And let's come back here to see if there's any other notes that we need. No. Okay, so now we have, you can see here the Ambassador dashboard showing some of the status of some of the components running in the system. Some of the hosts, so this was auto-registered for us when we did edgectl install and automatically set up TLS for this domain. If we click on mappings, we can see some of the existing mappings for routing traffic. An interesting component that we would like to see from our API gateways is edge security, request traffic and routing, transformations on requests and responses. We would like to see a way to expose APIs to developers and offer self-service and some of these other things. So we're going to we'll go through some of the getting started and kind of look through and match up with these different capabilities that we might want from an API gateway following the Ambassador documentation. So if we come here, let's see, we installed it. So that's all good. Not on Minikube. What's next? There is it getting started. Where the heck is it? All right, well, I don't know, it's fine. Let's search around a little bit more then. All right, we installed it. That's good. How do we get started? There's a getting started here. Create a mapping, sorry. All right, I just couldn't see it. Create a mapping. All right, so what we're going to do here is we're going to walk through this. We're going to deploy one of their sample services, quote.yaml. So let's do that. Let's copy this. Let's come over here. We'll add this to a file here. We'll do this. And we'll go into the, I guess we'll do it here. Quote.yaml. Save that, and then we'll cube apply quote. All right. So now if we get pod, we see the quote service up here and running. Now let's see how we can route to it. And in Ambassador, we route using the mapping resource. So we'll come back here, create a new, call this quote mapping, and we will apply that. Quote mapping. Okay, so now what that means is we should be able to apply the configuration. Yep, did that. By going to the host name and go into /backend, we should be able to call that. And we did see at some point here, it set up a DNS name for us. So let's try that. So now if we do curl that on backend, oh, not found. Oh, all right. I think the mapping has, let's look at our mappings here. I think the error I made here was the backend has a trailing slash. So we'll add that, see if that works better. That works better. Okay, excellent. So now we see our response coming from the quote service routed through the Ambassador gateway. So if we come back here, we should see that, which we did. Ambassador will show a little bit of the configuration details, developer onboarding. So the quote service exposes a Swagger doc. So let's take a look at, if we click on the APIs tab here, click on APIs, we do see the API documentation for the quote service. And there is, or should be, let's see. Here we go. So if we come over here to /docs, we should see, let's open up a new browser, docs. There we go. So now we come to the developer portal part of Ambassador, and we can see that we have these services enabled. And what else is here? You can add more stuff to the portal, I guess, to customize it. Come back here and click on the API itself. So you get, try it out. All right, execute. Not sure what's going on here, but you can see that you can expose your APIs to other developers through this listing of this little portal area. Okay, so the next thing we want to do, now we've established that we can do some basic routing into services that exist in the Kubernetes cluster. Now, another important part of an API gateway is edge security. So let's take a look at how we can secure the traffic to a service using Ambassador. So the thing we want to do here is try to find, like I said, their documentation is quite well organized. The security stuff. So authentication is here. What we're going to do is auth 0. We're going to do a OAuth integration with auth 0. Before we do that, though, what I want to do is I want to route. So we route it to services running inside of Kubernetes, but I also want to route to services running outside of Kubernetes. So if we click on core concepts and actually let's click on using Ambassador, there we go. The mapping object. So we saw earlier that mapping is how we define the routing. And what we want to do here is create another mapping, not for a service that exists in our Kubernetes cluster, but for one that exists outside of our Kubernetes cluster. This one being http://bin.org. If I hit headers here, it'll show me the headers that I use to call the service. If I try IP here, it'll show me my IP. And what we're going to do is use Ambassador to route to traffic that's running outside of the cluster. So let's come over here. This is http bin YAML. That looks fine. Now let's apply it. All right, now if we get mappings, we should see we have our HTTP bin mapping, our quote backend mapping. We should see the same thing in their console here. Let's see. Yep, quote HTTP bin. Now, if we call our service with HTTP bin like this, let's go ahead and grab that, or we'll get out of that. Go HTTP bin. We should go to, let's just call it like this. We'll see if we can get to the HTTP bin headers service, and we can. Okay, good. So we're routing correctly through to that and to IP. Excellent. So what we want to do now is add some security to routing to that particular service. So maybe that service is an external service, and we want to force everyone through our API gateway, and we want to control who can actually call that external services, because oftentimes calling external services becomes expensive. Maybe that external service is a service provider that limits the number of calls that you can make and so forth. So if we come into how to, you can see the documentation here. I clicked on authentication, basic, single sign-on with auth 0. And what we're going to do here is, firstly, we're going to go to auth 0 and create a new application following the docs. So if we click login, there we go, create application, call it my app. We're supposed to click on, let's follow this, machine to machine, click on that, say create. Down here, I think we have to select an API that we give access to. And then for the grants, I might have to, it says, whatever. We'll just give it all. And then authorize. Now we have our application. Now, all right, now we have to follow these directions. So we have to make sure token endpoint auth is post. Yep, and it is. That we want to make sure that the allowed callback URLs matches this URL here. So the image shows callback, but we'll follow the directions here. And then we need to get the correct domain name. So that should be fine for the URL. For the allowed web origins, I think it's just this. That's good. All right. Oh, and you got to get this part. Click advanced settings, ramp types, and auth code. Advanced settings, grant types, and auth code. Okay. I think that should be good. Save the changes. So we should be good on the auth 0 side. Now on the ambassador side, we'll have to create these different YAML resources here. The filter that describes we'll call this HTTP bin filter. Let's just copy the YAML file here, and then we'll get it over. Oh. All right, now we got to fill in things like the auth URL, which I think they give guidance for here. So it's the domain, client URL. Oh no, so that's the auth0 domain, and then the domain on which the API gateway listens at, and then the API for auth0. Okay, so let's try to do that. So the API is this. Should be that. Oh, let's keep the HTTPS. Then we want our domain, which is the API right here. Then we want the audience, which is, remind me, the audience of your API, auth0, I think it's that. All right. Sorry, jumping around a little bit here. Just want to make sure that we get this right. And then the client ID would be here. Client ID is right here. Client ID and then client secret, which we're pasting directly into the YAML. We'll check in a second to see if there's a way to do that differently. And then this right here, ban policy, I think that all looks good. That doesn't need to change. So I think we have all this stuff. All right, let's come back to our docs. Auth0, that looks good. And then I think we should apply that. Let's apply. What was it? HTTP bin, filter. Invalid name. All right, let's fix that. That I think should probably be fixed in the docs too. Try that again. There we go. So now we've got that. So let's do, okay, get filter. See the default filter there, or the auth0 filter there in the web portal, the UI here, filters. We see it configured here. And then now if we come back to our API and we're forcing this through the API gateway, we should be challenged for auth0. Let's see, it looks like we do, and we get the challenge. Okay, sign in, and it lets us through. Okay, so we're able to do routing. We can route to external traffic. We can secure it with OIDC. That's all good. Slightly running out of time here. Now, one thing I did point out earlier was that Ambassador is built on top of Envoy. And Envoy is a very powerful proxy that can be used at the edge, can be used as a shared gateway, can be used like we see in service meshes as a service proxy. Now, one thing about Envoy is that you can configure it with static files. You can configure it with a control plane that has dynamic API. And so what we're going to do here real quick is take a look at the Ambassador install and look at Envoy. So we see quote we installed because that was our sample service. We have Redis, I'm assuming is probably for rate limiting functionality. And then we have the Ambassador Ambassador pod itself. If we wanted to, let's say we're taking on more traffic. Let's look at the deployments here. If we're taking on more traffic, we can scale out the Ambassador installation here. So like if we did, let's edit the deployment here and find replica. replica. All right, let's make that 3. And what we should see is, what? They not like that? Oh, I must have, here. Let's try that again. Edit, replica. There we go. Try that again, paste that 3, right quit. All right, now we should see the ambassador pod start to scale up, which we do. So there's coming up. Now, what's interesting is that Envoy, unless it's using static files, uses a control plane to get its configuration. Let's take a look. Let's shell into the ambassador pod here. And let's see what is running inside of it. Because we want to know, is this using static configuration files, or is it using an Envoy control plane? So if we do a listing of the services running inside this container, we can see we have a bunch of stuff. We have our Envoy right here, and then we have a bunch of other things looking like diagnostic scripts, and here's the entry point, and a few other things running in here. So let's take a look at this. Looks like to be that the configuration that we're passing to Envoy. Envoy. Let's take a look at that file. That's the bootstrap config. What we see is the admin. Okay, so the admin port is set up there on 8001 for Envoy. And then we see definitions for the XDS. So we are using the Envoy XDS API, and it looks like we are connecting to the Envoy XDS through this Envoy cluster. And this Envoy cluster seems to be looking at port 8003 on localhost. So the control plane looks like is running inside the same pod here as Envoy. So if we come back here, let's start. Let's grab, what was that, 8003? 8003 is Ambex. So that was one of the things that we saw here, right? So we have, so this looks like it is the XDS server for Envoy, and so Envoy is connecting up. So this thing must be watching the Kubernetes config and translating things into the Envoy configuration file, which means this is all kind of inside a single pod here. Not totally sure what that one does, but it looks like it reaches out and calls some Python. So that's interesting to note, that the control plane and the data plane are part of the same pod. And in this case, when we scaled up to 3, we're scaling up instances of all of that. So that's all we have for today. We are going to continue the series. So we looked at Ambassador today. We're going to continue the series by looking at Kong and next week. And Rick Ducott from our team will be giving that presentation. We'll look at Trafic and Contour in subsequent series episodes as well. We'll look at Gloo. Somebody else will do that one. And we are looking for input and thoughts and comments on either Twitter or directly on the YouTube feed. If you would like to see a gateway or a proxy covered here that we don't have in the list or don't have scheduled yet, then please reach out to us. We We want to help educate the community on these different technologies. Check out episode number 7, which sets the landscape for what are these technologies, why are we talking about them, how they fit into the landscape. And definitely check out some of the previous episodes on service mesh, any of the specific service mesh implementations. Now, as we go and look at some more of these proxies, we're going to eventually tie this all back into understanding how they fit together and why you might have one or the other or both. And we'll continue to help answer questions about architecture, about specific technologies, and guide the community, help guide the community, get input as well on adopting these things, because some of these things are fairly complicated and it's not always very clear how they fit and come together. So with that, thank you so much. Look forward to the next episodes. Please join next week when Rick covers Kong, and follow the YouTube live, the YouTube channel. All right, thank you.